Adam Schiff walked into that hearing wearing the confidence of a master prosecutor, but within 40 seconds, he looked more like a senator who had memorized the performance while forgetting the professional standards behind it. He arrived with the rigid jaw, the tightly held briefing folder, and the familiar television expression of a man who assumes every room will surrender the moment he starts speaking. For years, Schiff had marketed himself as the adult surrounded by amateurs, the intelligence expert surrounded by conspirators, and the legal authority surrounded by people too reckless or dishonest to understand the evidence. Yet the weakness beneath that image was always the same. Schiff was extraordinarily skilled at announcing certainty, but remarkably weak when forced to prove that his strongest words matched the official record. Mike Johnson did not need to overpower him, because Schiff entered the room carrying the precise defect Johnson intended to expose. The hearing was formally about intelligence community reform, but Schiff immediately tried to convert it into another partisan prosecution centered on January 6th, constitutional oaths, democratic legitimacy, and Mike Johnson's role in challenging the 2020 election. It was a familiar maneuver because Schiff's political strength has never depended primarily on technical depth. It has depended on seizing the moral frame before anyone else can define the dispute. He spoke for roughly 4 minutes, portraying himself as the courageous official punished for telling Americans that a presidential campaign had been compromised by a foreign adversary. He then aimed directly at Johnson, arguing that the real hypocrisy was allowing a man who had questioned the election results to preside over a hearing concerning institutional integrity and accountability. The attack was polished, aggressive, and perfectly designed for television, but it also contained the one word that would collapse Schiff's preferred battlefield: evidence. Johnson did not defend his voting record, debate January 6th, or chase Schiff into the sprawling political argument Schiff had prepared in advance. He adjusted his glasses, opened the binder in front of him, and treated the word evidence not as campaign language, but as a legal term carrying a professional definition. Both men were lawyers, both had attended law school, and Schiff had built his public identity around his experience as a federal prosecutor, so there was no credible way for him to pretend the distinction was unfamiliar. Johnson's question was devastating because it was narrow. When Schiff repeatedly said evidence, was he using the word as lawyers use it or as political fundraisers use it? Schiff had expected accusations of hypocrisy, dishonesty, or partisanship, but he had not prepared for someone to remove the theatrical packaging and examine the vocabulary itself. That distinction matters because Adam Schiff did not present himself to television viewers as an ordinary partisan offering a speculative opinion based on newspaper reports. He chaired the House Intelligence Committee, received classified briefings unavailable to the public, and spoke with the borrowed authority of a prosecutor who supposedly understood the difference between allegation, inference, suspicion, circumstantial evidence, and direct evidence. On March 22, 2017, Schiff told CNN that the evidence was not merely circumstantial, but direct, language so strong that any competent attorney would recognize the burden attached to it. On February 14, 2018, he told MSNBC that ample evidence concerning collusion already existed in the public domain, again removing hesitation and presenting the matter as something already established. On April 7, 2019, he told ABC News that evidence of collusion was in plain sight, choosing certainty once again because certainty was more politically valuable than professional caution. Those were not statements that investigators might eventually uncover proof that suspicious contacts deserved scrutiny, or that Schiff's preliminary assessment remained subject to revision. They were declarations from a former prosecutor who wanted the public to believe that the case was already visible, already substantial, and already supported by evidence ordinary Americans were simply unable to inspect for themselves. Johnson then placed Schiff's televised certainty beside the official findings, beginning with the Mueller report released on April 18, 2019, which did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. He added the December 2019 report from Inspector General Michael Horowitz, which identified at least 17 significant errors or omissions in the FISA application process and badly weakened the image of an immaculate investigative foundation. He followed with John Durham's May 2023 conclusion that the FBI had relied on raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence while failing to uphold its obligation of strict fidelity to the law. Schiff attempted the standard retreat, broadening the discussion toward documented contacts, disputing Durham's credibility, and trying to replace his absolute public language with a safer argument about interpretation. Johnson refused to let him escape, returning again to the legal meaning of evidence and demanding that Schiff explain whether his repeated declarations had been precise or merely politically useful. A direct answer was dangerous because admitting loose usage would expose professional recklessness, while defending legal precision would force Schiff to justify certainty that the final investigative record never delivered in the form he had promised. The former prosecutor, who had spent years narrowing questions for witnesses, was now trapped inside one of his own words, and the weakness of his expertise was becoming impossible to hide behind committee titles or television cadence. But Johnson had only opened the first section of the binder, because the next tab would reveal why Schiff's certainty remained valuable even after the investigations failed to validate it. And the answer was measured not in legal definitions, but in millions of dollars. Mike Johnson turned the page because exposing Adam Schiff's misuse of the word evidence only explained the professional failure, while the next section explained why that failure remained politically profitable long after the official investigations refused to deliver what Schiff had promised. The senator's weakness was no longer merely that he had spoken with more certainty than the record could support. It was that the certainty had become a fundraising asset, repeatedly packaged, televised, and converted into contributions from people who assumed a former federal prosecutor would not manipulate legal language for political gain. Johnson introduced Brenda Holloway, a retired postal worker from Bakersfield who had spent 31 years carrying other people's mail before retiring in 2020 on a pension of roughly $2,800 per month. Brenda watched MSNBC, trusted Schiff's declarations, and began sending $25 each month because she believed the intelligence chairman possessed direct evidence unavailable to ordinary citizens. Over 8 years, those contributions totaled $2,400, a meaningful sacrifice from a fixed income and an embarrassing monument to how effectively Schiff's shaky expertise had been marketed as unquestionable authority. Schiff had classified briefings, committee access, institutional status, and the vocabulary of a prosecutor, while Brenda had a television screen and the reasonable assumption that the man using the word evidence understood what that word required. That imbalance was the engine of the transaction, because donors could not inspect the intelligence, test Schiff's interpretation, or compare his televised certainty with the underlying material hidden behind classification rules. They had to trust the professional credibility he deliberately placed at the center of every appearance, and Schiff understood that this credibility carried far more financial value than an ordinary partisan opinion. Brenda was not donating to a detailed policy program or purchasing influence inside Washington. She believed she was supporting the official brave enough to reveal proof that others were supposedly hiding. By the time the investigations failed to establish the decisive case Schiff had repeatedly advertised, her money was already inside the political machine, and no revised interpretation could return what certainty had extracted. Johnson then opened the campaign filings and allowed the numbers to expose how little Schiff's fundraising operation suffered when his public claims weakened under scrutiny. In 2018, during the height of Schiff's television campaign about collusion and direct evidence, his political operation raised approximately $14.3 million, turning every appearance into another opportunity to present himself as the prosecutor standing between democracy and a concealed conspiracy. In 2019, the year the Mueller report did not establish coordination or conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, Schiff raised roughly $12.7 million, proving that the absence of confirmation did not destroy the brand because the brand had already learned to monetize delay. In 2020, after the investigation had closed and the central promise of decisive proof had grown weaker rather than stronger, fundraising climbed to approximately $16, $4 million, an astonishing reward for a senator whose greatest professional talent appeared to be converting unresolved accusations into permanent urgency. Evidence no longer functioned as a description of verified proof. It had become the name of the product, and the product remained profitable precisely because it was always described as existing just beyond the public's reach. Every television interview extended the suspense. Every accusation of obstruction protected the narrative, and every Republican criticism generated another email warning supporters that Schiff was being targeted because he had supposedly come too close to the truth. The structure was politically efficient because confirmation was unnecessary. Proof generated outrage. Missing proof generated claims of concealment, and accusations of exaggeration generated victimhood, allowing Schiff to profit from success, failure, and scrutiny at the same time. Johnson moved to the 2023 censure vote, when Schiff's campaign sent a fundraising appeal during the vote itself, warning that MAGA Republicans were spreading defamatory lies and urging supporters to contribute immediately rather than providing a disciplined, evidentiary answer to the allegations against him. That quarter produced approximately $8. $2 million, the strongest fundraising quarter of Schiff's career, turning official condemnation over his public claims into the most lucrative event of his political life, and revealing a machine so cynical that accountability itself became premium inventory. But the next section of Johnson's binder was more dangerous than campaign arithmetic, because it asked whether Schiff's privileged access, absolute representations, electronic solicitations, and millions in receipts formed something more serious than ordinary political dishonesty. And Schiff's desperate retreat into the word assessment was about to make that question even harder to escape. Johnson allowed Adam Schiff to hide behind the word assessment for only a few seconds, because that retreat exposed exactly how weak Schiff's technical defense had become once his television certainty was placed beside the investigative record. An assessment is cautious by nature, a professional judgment made while facts remain incomplete. Evidence continues developing, and reasonable officials may still reach different conclusions without pretending that the matter has already been proven. Schiff, however, had not spent years telling viewers that his preliminary assessment suggested investigators might eventually discover direct evidence somewhere inside the files. He repeatedly declared that the evidence was direct, ample, and visible in plain sight, using the strongest possible language while wrapping himself in the authority of a former federal prosecutor and Intelligence Committee chairman. Now that the promised certainty had become impossible to defend, the Senate's most over-marketed legal expert suddenly wanted his absolute declarations remembered as modest interpretations. Johnson dismantled that revision with the transcripts themselves, because Schiff's public statements contained none of the qualifications he was attempting to insert after the fact. There was no perhaps, no warning that the intelligence remained incomplete, no admission that the available material could support multiple interpretations, and no acknowledgement that future investigations might fail to establish the conclusion he had already presented as obvious. Schiff chose prosecutorial certainty because certainty created authority, and authority created attention, while careful language would have reduced both the political drama and the fundraising urgency built around his appearances. A genuine assessment can be revised when new evidence emerges, but Schiff never returned after the Mueller report to admit that his earlier language had exceeded what the investigation could establish. The correction never arrived because correcting the record would have damaged the product, and the product was no longer an investigation, but the permanent impression that Schiff possessed proof hidden from everyone else. Johnson then connected the public claims, electronic solicitations, and campaign receipts to the structure of federal wire fraud law without recklessly declaring that a criminal case had already been proven. He identified the familiar elements: a scheme to defraud, a material misrepresentation, the use of wire communications, and an intention to obtain money, while carefully acknowledging that proving criminal intent would remain a separate and difficult legal challenge. Television carried Schiff's declarations, email delivered the urgent requests, and campaign accounts received the contributions, creating a visible chain that looked far uglier than the senator's polished speeches about constitutional duty. Johnson also noted that a former Federal Election Commission official had reviewed a complaint involving Schiff and concluded that the matter contained enough evidence to justify civil inquiry and serious consideration by the Department of Justice. The American public spent roughly $32 million on the Mueller investigation, while Schiff raised approximately $80 million, repeatedly speaking about evidence he insisted the investigation would validate, meaning taxpayers financed the search while donors financed the promise that the answer had already been found. That arithmetic was devastating because Schiff could argue about interpretation, partisan motives, and the credibility of individual reports. But he could not erase the financial value created by his repeated claims of privileged certainty. Johnson returned to Brenda Holloway, whose $25 monthly donations transformed the massive totals into something Schiff could not safely dismiss as ordinary campaign bookkeeping. Brenda believed prosecutors used words carefully, believed classified access carried responsibility, and believed a man who had once exercised federal prosecutorial power understood the moral difference between suspicion and proof. Schiff's operation monetized that belief while denying donors any ability to inspect the intelligence for themselves, leaving them dependent on his professional reputation and his increasingly theatrical descriptions of what the record supposedly contained. In Washington, knowingly selling the wrong answer can be wrapped in patriotic language, distributed through a campaign committee, and celebrated as grassroots enthusiasm, but the transaction remains morally rotten when the seller's credentials are the reason the buyer trusted the claim. Johnson opened the final section of the binder, and the hearing room screen displayed a chart containing 2 lines whose simplicity made Schiff's verbal evasions look almost comical. The blue line tracked television appearances in which Schiff used the word evidence, while the red line tracked fundraising receipts during the same periods, and the 2 lines rose, fell, and peaked with a strikingly similar rhythm. Johnson described the relationship as correlation rather than causation, showing more professional restraint in one sentence than Schiff had displayed across years of declarations. But the visual still revealed how closely media exposure and political revenue had moved together. Every televised claim increased urgency. Every suggestion of hidden proof strengthened Schiff's authority. And every fundraising message converted that authority into cash from donors who could not verify what he claimed to know. But the chart was only the beginning, because once that image escaped the hearing room and reached millions of viewers, Schiff would no longer be fighting Mike Johnson. He would be fighting a pattern the public could understand without trusting either political party. The chart escaped the hearing room because Adam Schiff's problem was no longer confined to Mike Johnson's binder, one committee exchange, or one hostile Republican interpretation of his record. Within 72 hours, the clip showing the blue line of television appearances and the red line of fundraising receipts reached approximately 26 million views across social media. The image did more damage than any insult because viewers needed neither classified access nor legal training to understand that Schiff's televised certainty and political revenue moved together with disturbing consistency. Johnson did not claim that correlation alone proved criminal intent, but he exposed the machinery behind a senator who had spent years disguising political salesmanship as professional judgment and constitutional duty. Once the public saw the rhythm, Schiff's repeated use of evidence sounded less like legal analysis and more like inventory displayed before the next urgent solicitation reached another anxious donor. A second clip, viewed roughly 17 million times, captured Schiff retreating from direct evidence into the safer language of assessment, and legal professionals immediately recognized the weakness of that manufactured defense. Former prosecutors, defense attorneys, law professors, and commentators understood that professional credibility depends on separating suspicion from proof, preliminary judgment from established fact, and inference from direct evidence. Schiff had borrowed prosecutorial authority whenever certainty benefited him, then demanded the flexibility of partisan commentary when the official record made that certainty impossible to defend without embarrassment. He wanted viewers to hear courtroom precision when he accused others, but he wanted his own declarations judged as harmless political interpretation once the investigations closed and the bill arrived. His resume therefore stopped functioning as protection and became evidence that he understood exactly how recklessly he had used the vocabulary, prestige, and institutional authority of his former profession. Schiff's office called the hearing partisan revisionism, defended his interpretation of the intelligence, and invoked the First Amendment, but that response avoided Johnson's central question about accuracy and financial incentive. Protected speech is not automatically accurate speech, and constitutional protection does not turn an overstated claim into responsible conduct simply because an elected official delivered it beneath studio lights. Campaign finance watchdogs requested Federal Election Commission scrutiny of the relationship between Schiff's appearances, his fundraising emails, and repeated claims about evidence used to create urgency among small-dollar donors. A similar complaint had died in a 3-3 deadlock in 2022, yet renewed attention made the issue harder to bury as a technical dispute understood only by campaign lawyers. The comparison remained brutally narrow. What did Schiff know from classified briefings? What did he tell the public? And what did his campaign imply while requesting money from people who trusted him? During the second week, a nonpartisan government accountability organization requested a preliminary Senate Ethics Committee review without alleging that a criminal violation had already been established against Schiff. That records-based request asked whether Schiff's donor communications were consistent with the intelligence available to him, stripping away his preferred defense that every challenge was merely partisan persecution. Legal analysts cautioned that Johnson's wire fraud theory would require difficult proof of intent, and that donors may have contributed for reasons beyond Schiff's Russia-related claims and television appearances. Yet Johnson did not need an indictment to expose the moral structure because privileged access, absolute public representations, electronic solicitations, and approximately $80 million occupied the same documented record. Schiff might avoid criminal liability, but he could not make the transaction look honorable by renaming certainty as interpretation after the campaign deposits had cleared and the donors had already paid. The hardest blow came when Brenda Holloway appeared on Bakersfield television from the kitchen where she had watched Schiff's interviews and sent her modest monthly contributions from retirement income. Brenda explained that she trusted him because a former federal prosecutor with classified access should have understood the responsibility attached to the word evidence before repeatedly using it publicly. She admitted that she continued believing Schiff after the investigations weakened his claims, then reduced the entire controversy to one humiliating fact. He was not right, and she could not recover her money. Her interview reached roughly 5 million views, turning an $80 million fundraising achievement into millions of small sacrifices extracted through professional confidence, unsupported by professional precision or meaningful correction. Taxpayers spent roughly $32 million searching for proof, while Schiff raised approximately $80 million, suggesting the proof was already visible, because the evidence was never the product. The word was the product, and Johnson finally showed the country the receipt.